Hi, I'm Karen with the Gaithersburg Community Museum. Welcome to our ongoing celebration of the passage of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. Today we have a really special program for you. Mary Church Terrell, a leading activist in the suffrage movement for Black women and in the civil rights movement, has agreed to be interviewed, and the interviewer will be a local high school student, Joie Allen, who's a junior at Magruder High School. Welcome, Joy.
Hi.
Hi, Joy. Thank you for joining us today and for agreeing to interview Mary Church Terrell.
Oh, no problem. No problem. So Mary Church Terrell was one of the first African-American women to earn a college degree and become known as a national activist for civil rights and suffrage. She also taught in the Latin department at the first African-American public high school in the nation. Everybody, Mary Church Terrell. Hi, Ms. Terrell. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm doing very well. Thank you. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for allowing me to do this interview with you.
Oh, you're most welcome.
So, the first question I have for you is about your mother. She was an amazing lady and role model.
Yes, she was.
Could you share with us how her spirit and her focus on the importance of education shaped your character?
Oh, my goodness. Oh, yes. It most definitely shaped my character. My mother, I won't say she was ahead of her time, but she was a very unique person. She always had a sunny disposition, and she didn't allow the situation that we were in to deter her from what she wanted to accomplish. Now, when she and my father married, he was an upcoming businessman, but it was her business as a hairdresser and the owner of a hair store where she sold wiglets and hair pieces that she was so successful. She paid the down payment on their first home with her earnings, not his. Now, my mother and my father were both born into slavery. Fortunately for them, they were not on plantations where they were worked to death or beaten or mistreated. No, in fact, my father was the son of his master and a slave woman. But my mother was raised by a family that thought highly enough of her. Her mother was the maid in the family, and they actually taught her to read and write, even though it was illegal to do so. And she actually took French lessons, and she knew that for a woman at that time to be educated and for a colored woman to be educated was a great advantage. And she wanted me to have an even better advantage since now slavery had ended. And she's there in Memphis, where I was born in 1863, that the schools were segregated and they were deplorable for colored children. Our school was 2 classrooms in the basement of a church. And she wanted something better for me. So she decided to take me north to Yellow Springs, Ohio, and enrolled me in school at the model school at Antioch College. And I stayed there with a wonderful family, boarded with them, and I would come home in the summer. But while I was there, I thought, my parents, especially my mother, has gone through all this trouble to make sure that I am educated. And I loved school. I wasn't a goody two shoes. I like to run and play and have a good time, but I love my studies. And I knew that I was only one colored student at the school for a while. I was the only one. And I didn't experience a great deal of prejudice, but I knew that because I was a colored girl in this situation, I had better make the best of it. And so I studied as hard as I could, and I made excellent grades, and then went on from there to Oberlin High School and then to Oberlin College. And it was because my mother was so enterprising. You know, she and my father divorced, and that was something that did not happen. It was scandalous. Didn't scandalize her at all. She was her own woman, and that's what she decided. She moved to New York City and reopened a business there and was very successful. So I saw her as someone who determined their own path and made the best of every opportunity that was given to them. And I decided I wanted to do that too. I knew I had privilege, and I didn't want to think of myself as better than others, but instead think of myself as someone who could use what I had to better myself and then use that to help others.
Wow, that's great, Ms. Terrell. I also read that in your day, our 4th-year college path was known as the gentleman's path. Can you share with us how you were able to pursue and successfully complete your college education?
Oh my goodness, that's a wonderful question because it brings back wonderful memories. When I was in high school at Oberlin High School, and I studied Latin and I studied Greek, and my friends, my women friends, young girls, we were just girls at that time, said, why would you want to study that? That's so hard. And while you're doing that, you could be out having a good time instead of having 2 extra hours of studying. Besides, you'll never find a husband if you're too smart. Where are you going to find a man of our race that knows Greek and Latin? Now, that got to me for a moment, but it didn't deter me completely. I said, no, I want to study as much as I can when I go to school. So I wrote to my father, and by this time, he was very, very wealthy. He was the wealthiest colored man in the South. And so I knew money wouldn't be an object, but I didn't know how he felt about his daughter getting this kind of education. So I laid out a very explicit plan about what I wanted to do and how I wanted to do it, and would he please would he please consent to me pursuing the 4 years in school? He wrote back and told me that I could go to college as long as I wanted to. He would pay my tuition. And so that was that. So I did study the 4-year course. I enjoyed my time at Oberlin. Again, there were only a handful of colored girls there, but that experience taught me that the races can live together and be friends. One of my best friends was a white girl that was blonde and blue-eyed, and one was another colored girl like myself, and we have remained friends to this day. And that experience really shaped me and prepared me to go out into the world and be confident that I had used my opportunities and my mind and my energy to pursue excellence. I worked as hard as I could on every single course that I took: mathematics, Latin, English, music. I sang in the choir. I wrote for the school paper. My time there was very well spent, and I enjoyed it. And later on, I went back and got a master's degree.
Wow. Okay. I also read that you experienced a lot of hostility on 2 sides. First, as a suffragist, you dealt with both men and women mocking you for supporting your cause. Secondly, as a Black woman, you experience racism. How do you address the ugly, deadly roots of slavery and the segregation which resulted?
Well, you have to face it as it is, and at the same time have hope that by facing it, it can be changed. The colored woman has a unique burden in the society. White women only had the burden of sex, and the colored man only had the burden of race. Only the colored woman had the double burden of living in a society where her race and her sex were deemed inferior. And you are absolutely right. We were not welcomed with our stand on women getting their rights. There were actually women who were not in favor of women having rights. I got the idea to become a suffrage, to support women's suffrage when I was at Oberlin. It was a very open-minded school. It was the first school that admitted women and colored people. So they had an open-minded intellectual approach that other schools didn't. And while I was there, I learned about women like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton writing the Declaration of Sentiments and saying that women should have rights. And I thought, absolutely. Again, going back to your question about my mother should have the same rights as any man. I should have the same rights as any man. Any woman should have a say in the laws that govern her. And so I'll never forget, I was in Washington and I was working at the M Street High School. And I had been going to lectures and speeches that the women's conferences were having, and Susan B. Anthony was at this particular one. And the room was full, the auditorium was full. And she said, if you believe that women have the right to vote in this country, stand to your feet and make it known. And I thought, surely people will stand up, but only a handful of people stood up. And I have to tell you, I was a bit nervous about it because it was not a popular stand, but I knew I could not live with myself if I did not make it known that this was something I believed in. So I stood up. Now, I went back and relayed this to my colleague, Robert Terrell, and he replied that, oh dear, you have completely ruined your chances of getting a husband. I responded to him, I would never be foolish enough to marry a man who didn't believe that I should have the same rights as him. Well, fortunately, he was teasing me. He was a supporter of women's suffrage as well. And the other funny thing about that story is that Robert had graduated from Harvard College in Massachusetts with a degree in Greek and Latin. So my friends were wrong. I did find a man of my race who spoke Greek and Latin. And that was one of the things that brought us together while we were working there at the school. So on the other hand, when I was at Oberlin, I met one of the only man that signed the Declaration of Sentiments in 1848 at the National Women's Convention. And that was Mr. Frederick Douglass, one of the finest men that this country has ever produced. And I had the privilege of meeting him when I was at Oberlin. And he had been on board women's suffrage all along, but after the Civil War, it was decided that society was not ready for such a huge change as Negro men getting the vote and all women getting the vote. And so women like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, all these women, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, all these women, Negro and white, thought, after all this work we've done in the abolition movement, supporting the end of slavery, we've proven that we are worthy of getting the vote. Look what we did in the Civil War. We were nurses, we were soldiers. Some women disguised themselves as men and became soldiers to end slavery in this country. We raised money, we fed the poor, we nursed the sick. The first woman doctor became an army doctor during the Civil War. We have proven that we have a right to be full citizens. But Frederick Douglass and the other men, for the most part, decided and said, no, it's more important that the colored man get the vote after slavery so that he can be a man. And unfortunately, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and some others decided that in order to get more women on the side of women's suffrage, they would have to cater to the women of the South who absolutely opposed colored men having the vote and were afraid that if women got the vote, that meant colored women would vote. And they began to circulate the idea that no, colored women shouldn't have the vote, only educated white women should have the vote, not immigrants and not colored men either. But since they already had the vote, it was more important that white women would get the vote so that they would be the colored man would be outnumbered. And this was very hurtful. They wouldn't allow us, for the most part, to join their organization, the National Association for Women's Suffrage. Lucretia Mott started a different group, the American Women's Suffrage Association, and they were opposed to kowtowing to the Southern prejudices and all the horrible things that they said, that, that the colored man was low and mentally inferior and not deserving of the vote. And mind you, these were my friends. And because of our friendship, I was the one colored woman who could go before them and speak. And so I used that opportunity. Once at Washington, when we had a convention, they were passing around a petition of things that they wanted to be addressed by the government. And one of them was they wanted a petition saying that they wanted to end cruelty to animals. And I thought to myself, Colored people are being lynched. We are being denied jobs, decent housing, decent wages, but you won't put this on your platform. You don't want to admit that the colored woman needs a vote when most colored women are working as laundresses or domestic work and can't get into school because of prejudice. And you want to pass a law about animal rights? There's nothing wrong with that. But I stood up and I said, you want to pass a law and you're standing up for animal rights? I want you to stand up for the rights of colored women. We are not going to move forward as a country until every white person in this country understands that holding down the colored man and the colored woman is denying the country the greatness that we have to offer. So I tried to be diplomatic about it. I tried to use my connections to the suffrage movement to further our cause. But as I said, we had the burden of being perceived as inferior because we were women and because we were colored. It was an uphill battle, but I never lost hope and I never used that as an excuse. I had my education, I had a loving, supportive husband, and I had all these women who were my friends who wanted to see our race progress. And look at how much we had progressed in just 50 years after slavery. We had colored women who were doctors, who were lawyers, who were teachers, who were starting schools, starting their own businesses. And every chance I got to speak to the suffragist organizations, I reminded them of this fact and let them know that they were on the wrong side of history.
Wow, that is powerful. So, Ms. Terrell, I understand that you were in the 1913 March. Can you tell us about that?
Oh my goodness, yes. Speaking of the suffragists and the barriers to colored women joining, this is a perfect example. They didn't want to alienate the white women of the South, so they discouraged us from participating in the march. Alice Paul was the organizer of the march, and it was a brilliant idea. It was the first time that women had ever marched, and there were thousands of women that had come from all over the country. And so the Delta sorority had just begun at Howard University, and my husband was an alumnus of Howard, and of course it was the premier institution of learning for colored people in the country, and we were living there in Washington. So I connected myself with these young women, and they said, since it formed in 1913, the first gesture to show that we are here to serve and are serious about our studies and our future as colored women, uplifting our race, is to participate in the march. And so they wrote to Alice Paul and said that the sorority was interested in marching. Well, they never heard back from her. And then news got out that we were being discouraged from participating, and the National Association said, no, you have to include them. They have to be given every courtesy that everyone else is shown. But it was discouraged. And then my good friend Ida B. Wells, who was also, well, she was born in Mississippi, but she lived in Memphis as well. She was in Illinois, in Chicago, and she was very active in the suffragist movement, and she was the one who was the most adamant about ending lynching as well. Lynching was an horrendous problem. That is what propelled both of us into the movement of advocating for our race. Was we had a mutual friend in Memphis, Tom Moss, who was lynched, and he had done absolutely nothing wrong, and that propelled her to write her research about lynching and travel to Europe and all over the country speaking about it. And that is what propelled me to not only become a suffragist, but to use my pen. I wrote articles and went around speaking about trying to take away the myths that were being spread about colored people, that, you know, that we were low and degraded and debauched and all the other horrible things that the newspapers said. I stood up for my people on any platform that I could. And so we did get to march. They asked us to march in the back of the parade. And as it turns out, maybe even though that was insulting, it might have turned out in our favor, because the men that came out, and you can see in that photograph, there were thousands of people there. It was the day of Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, and there were more people at the parade than there were at the inauguration for the president. And the men were harassing the women in the parade, throwing things, grabbing them, ripping their clothes, and the police did absolutely nothing until finally the captain of the police sent in the army, and they had to escort the parade because it had become a mob scene almost. It was horrendous the way these men were behaving. But these brave women, they continued that march, and it really was a beautiful event. And after that, we picketed the White House, which is something else that had never happened. And so we made history, but Ida made the most history because she refused to march at the back of the parade. She stood on the sidelines, and when the Illinois delegation came along, she stepped out from the side and with her two friends who supported her and said that they felt that they should stand up to the South and not give in to their prejudice and their race hatred. And she marched in the parade with her delegation, and I've always admired her for that.
And speaking of your husband earlier, as a married woman, how does your husband see your role in the suffrage movement? Is he supportive?
Well, as I said, he teased me about it before we were married and said that I wouldn't be able to find a husband. And then I didn't have to find one. He was already there because he was the principal at the school and I was teaching there. And at that time, married women were not allowed to teach. So I had to give up my teaching career. And the funny thing about all of that is I was not a young bride. I was in my late 20s when I married. And at that time, that was very unusual. Most girls run away from school to get married. I ran away from school. They run away from home to get married. I ran away from home to work because my father was a very old-fashioned Southern man. And even though he paid for all that education and had sent me to Europe for 2 years to study, he wanted me to come home and do nothing because ladies didn't work. And he thought to himself, well, you don't have to work. I can provide everything for you. Why would you take a job away from someone else? But I couldn't fathom taking all the education and all the learning that I had and sitting with china and silverware and being a hostess when our people, the children, needed good teachers. When I arrived in Washington, day after day, I would hear the young men say, what is the use of us studying when there's no opportunity for us because people won't hire colored men? Everyone can't be a doctor or a lawyer. What is the point of our going to school? And that is how Robert and I bonded, because we saw how important it was for us to do work, whatever work we could. And so there was never any question with him as to whether or not I should be active in the uplift of our race. That was our commitment. He was a judge that was appointed to the bench, and that made my father happy because he didn't want me to marry Robert. He didn't think that he could support me in the manner to which I had become accustomed. But Robert won him over by telling him that he was very ambitious as a lawyer. He, as I said, had graduated from Howard School of Law, and he proved to be a worthy companion. He supported me. He wrote articles as well about women getting their rights. And the funniest thing to him in the world was to overhear a conversation between a young man and a young woman about whether or not women should have the vote. He would come home and say, oh, you should have heard that woman wipe up the floor with that arrogant young coxcomb. There was nothing left but a grease spot when she got through sharpening her tongue on him. So he always supported women because he knew, like most colored men at that time, I have to say, knew that if white women needed the vote, the colored women needed it more. We were being denied opportunities at every turn, no matter how educated you could be. And we were living with segregation. Here, my husband was a judge, and I had a master's degree and was teaching. It was hard for us to find housing. It was hard for us to find someplace to just sit down and have a cup of coffee in Washington, D.C., because the capital of the United States was completely segregated. So there was never any question that whatever we could do to further the cause of our race and secure our rights and our dignity, he was more than glad to see me do that.
And Ms. Terrell, you were also a charter member of the National Association of Colored Women and the NAACP. What were your hopes and goals for these organizations?
Oh, well, as our banner said, we were lifting as we climbed. We wanted to lift our people up out of the degradation that slavery and the remnants of that mentality of us being only here to serve others and not have aspirations and dreams of our own. And so now the National Association of Colored Women came about because women had always gathered together and worked for charitable causes, especially church women. You know, we had benevolent societies and missionary societies. And so women had been organizing even before slavery ended, as abolitionists, as just any outreach, things that people needed, women would organize and help with, building schools, taking care of children, taking care of our elders, whatever. And so as time went on and slavery ended, and we saw we still had to work together because we were not accepted by the predominant race, we also noticed that slavery didn't end the prejudice against us. And as I had said before, in the newspapers, in the songs, in the advertisements, colored women and colored men were portrayed as buffoons, as whores, as anything but decent, respectable people. And the straw that broke the camel's back was when, again, my friend Ida B. Wells was going around lecturing about lynching and how it was defended as because they said that the colored man was lusting after white women, and so he deserved this treatment, and this was to deter that kind of bestial behavior. And she, of course, spared no words in deterring that lie. And so one of the journalists in St. Louis said that she and all Black women were whores and that all Black men were thieves and rapists, and there wasn't an honest one among us. And that was the last straw. That was when we said we are going to come together and defend our honor and prove that we are decent, intelligent, respectable ladies, and we should be treated as such. And we're going to demand that we are treated as such. And so we're going to uplift the women who are not educated, who have not had opportunities, because if we don't reach out to them and to their children, then we will perpetuate this poverty and this lack of understanding of how to live together as one nation. And so the National Association of Colored Women was founded, and we set about every city that had a group. You know, we didn't determine one agenda. We said, you know what your community needs, do that, and we will support one another. So we began kindergartens, we began job training programs, we opened up residences for young girls who were coming up from the South looking for work because they ended up usually in deplorable situations because of segregation. And so we were lifting as we climbed and proving that we were capable and deserving of a chance to have opportunities that anyone else. And the NAACP started basically for the same reason, because lynching was so horrendous. There had been a horrible race riot in Springfield, Illinois. And so white and Black and Jewish men and women came together and said, we need to organize so that we can be a force politically and change the laws that are allowing our people to be killed and harassed with no legal recourse. No one was ever arrested in any lynching. It was always justified as the victim's fault. And the NAACP's goal was to end that, was to get the law to treat colored as well as white fairly. And that is my aspiration to this day, that the United States live up to its creed and defend and protect all of its citizens, regardless of whether they are women or men, Black or white. And so those were my goals and aspirations, and they still are.
Okay. Well, we are now living in very turbulent times, and we see and experience inequality, racism, and deadly arrests. I read about the cruelty experienced by suffragists who were force-fed with hoses in their mouths to swallow milk and eggs. Could you give us some advice on how we might move forward to justice and peace?
Yes, yes. And thank you for mentioning that it has been a difficult struggle. It wasn't just about people not liking us or maybe throwing things at us or calling us names. Women went to jail. In fact, on the day that the National Association of Women's Suffrage contacted me and asked me to picket, which I had been picketing with my daughter Phyllis, I wasn't available to go. And that very day was the day that they first arrested suffragists for marching and picketing in front of the White House. And had I been there, I would have gone to jail. And the treatment that they suffered, as you said, was horrendous. The food had bugs in it, so they refused to eat it. And then they were, like you said, force-fed. So it was a hard-won battle. And I have a pin that the association gave to all the women who picketed. But yes, the struggle didn't end then. Once we got the right to vote in 1920, the next thing to do was to organize. And that is what I say to this day, whenever there is a problem with mistreatment of people, with denial of certain basic rights, you have to organize and state your case and state the facts and reach across the aisle to people who will be your allies and not be discouraged by those who counter you. Unfortunately, the belief that women or anyone other than the dominant faction doesn't deserve the same rights is deeply rooted in many people, unfortunately. But I happen to believe that we can change these things, and I've seen the laws change. Now, Alice Paul has put together what she calls an equal rights amendment, and I have worked with her for that. But I have also, ever since we got the right to vote, have made sure that there are women's voting organizations all over the country. And we learn how to vote. We learn what the issues are on the ballot. We learn about the politicians. We have them come and talk to us and tell us what they are going to do for us if they want our vote. Because if they are not in compliance with what we believe is in our best interest, we won't support them. And this is how you make change. If you are united and they know that they need your vote to win an election and that you will support them if they support your cause, you can make changes. I've seen it myself. We haven't won the battle, as you said. It's still very, very turbulent, and there are still forces working against equality for all people. But if we unite and we do not allow ourselves to be discouraged, we can overcome those obstacles. I absolutely believe that in my heart. I'll never forget when, as I said, my father sent me to Europe to study. And I was in Berlin, and I was walking down the street, and I was passing the US consulate, and I saw the flag. And I got misty-eyed because I got homesick, and I thought, oh, there's Old Glory. And this little voice whispered in my head and said, that flag won't protect you when you go back home. You'll be discriminated against. You won't be able to go into a hotel and get a room. You won't be able to sit down at a table in a restaurant and have a meal. So why are you so excited about seeing the flag? And it pierced my heart. But I said, even though it has mistreated me and my people, we have lived in the United States for over 300 years, and our blood and our toil and our sacrifices built that country. And even though it has not been fair to me, I love it. And because I love it, I'm going to work to change it. And that is what you have to do when you feel discouraged. You have to remember the sacrifices of others and not give up so that you can live out their dream.
Wow. Well, thank you for your time, Ms. Terrell. Those are all
You're so welcome
for you.
Hi, thank you too. That was a fascinating program. We have a few questions from our audience. So, Ms. Terrell, the 19th Amendment ostensibly gave all women the right to vote. Do you feel that in reality, Black women ended up with that right?
Well, of course, no, that is not the case. The law simply said that you could not discriminate on the basis of race or sex, but that did not prevent the states, particularly the ones in the South, to continue disenfranchising women just as they had disenfranchised men. After Reconstruction in 1870, colored men were routinely disbarred from being able to vote in the South. And if they showed up at the polls, they were in danger of losing their lives. And many people did lose their lives attempting to vote. They would be harassed. And after the Ku Klux Klan was formed, it just became understood that you would not vote. There were a handful of colored people who were still voting in the South, but the majority were not. And so when the 19th Amendment passed, unfortunately, the same thing happened. My dear friend, Mary Bethune, who started her wonderful school in Daytona Beach, recalled to me that after she had gone about, as I said, we started these suffrage clubs, and she had gone around and gotten all the women to register to vote, and they had classes on how to pass the test because they had literacy tests in the South at that time for colored people, not for white people, and you had to pay a poll tax. And so we got together and they got together and learned about the tax. They prepared themselves backwards and forwards. And the Ku Klux Klan came and marched all through the town and then marched around the campus in an attempt to intimidate them. And it didn't work the first year, but they continued to do it to the point where after about the third election, they had seriously decreased the role of those who were still voting because it was just too dangerous. And then, of course, immigrant women, Chinese women could not vote. Native American, the Indian women could not vote. And so, no, it was one step, and it was a very important one. But again, that is why we had to continue going to court and educating ourselves on where the politicians stood, because if they were not going to do something about that, we didn't support them.
Okay, Joy, did you know anything about this history when we asked you to do this program?
No, I actually did not. So it was a really interesting and intriguing project for me to do, because I've always loved learning about African American women and all of their accomplishments throughout history and everything. And learning about Miss Terrell was really interesting for me, because learning about the suffrage movement and everything, and how it's not only the white suffragist women that were getting all the inequality. It was the colored women who were also suffragists, because it was really a lot for a Black female in those times to have their rights and everything. So I felt like it was really good for me to learn about it, and learning about Miss Terrell was it was a lot for me to take in, and it was really good for me. I felt like I learned a lot about it. So.
And so this question is actually for Sherrie, not Mary.
All right.
So Sherrie, you could have picked any woman from history. Why did you choose Mary Church Terrell?
That's a good question. Basically, for the same things that Joy mentioned. I was so surprised when I found out about her. I actually attended Oberlin College for a year and a half, and no one talked about her there at that time. I found out about her in a book, in a magazine. And I was shocked because I did not know that African-American women had been suffragists. I didn't know anything about the National Association of Colored Women. I didn't know that, again, as Mary said, the pictures that we saw at that time of African-American women were either they were enslaved or they were in poverty. They were sharecroppers or laundresses, and there's nothing wrong with that. Those people were decent human beings, and they were in a bad situation, and so they were poor. But we didn't learn about educated African-American women who were movers and shakers, who were active in the law, in medicine, in politics, and did all kinds of amazing things, wrote books, lectured, traveled. So her story was just phenomenal to me. This woman spoke 3 languages. She studied in Europe. She, was a member. I didn't know she was a charter member of the NAACP, and my whole family belonged to the NAACP, but I'd never heard about her. And so I realized that just as African-American history had been suppressed, women's history had been suppressed, and African-American women's history was at the bottom. And so I was so impressed by her elegance and her intelligence and her commitment. She never let up. She wrote, she spoke, she marched. She could have lived a life of luxury. She could have been what her father wanted her to be, a Southern lady that entertained and bought lovely dresses and had nice things. And she absolutely did not do that. She knew that lynching was wrong, that disenfranchisement was wrong, that segregation was wrong. And in her 80s, she led the movement that started the lawsuit to end segregation in Washington, D.C. So she never let up. She never let up. And that was so admirable to me. I said, I want to tell her story. So she was the first character that I ever did as a living history performer.
Wow. So drawing on the history from Mary Church Terrell and your own personal history, would you have any advice for the young women of Joie's generation? We certainly live in a time where there's a lot happening politically, and voting rights is in the news every day.
Mm-hmm.
What can they do?
The first thing they can do is educate themselves. Mary Church was very adamant about that. She said that, every available outlet we have to express ourselves and to get our rights, we have an obligation to exercise those. And so voting is absolutely, it's not even debatable. You have to vote, and you have to vote based on what you know and not what you've been told. So you have to educate yourself about the issues and who's running. But I also would say, as frustrating as these times are, and all of us, regardless of where you are on the spectrum politically, this is unprecedented, at least as far as I can tell. Maybe it's not. Maybe 100 years ago, with women trying to get the vote, everybody felt it was just as crazy. Everybody thinks they live in the craziest times, I guess. But you stand on some wonderful shoulders, some strong, broad, hard-won battling shoulders. And so this is, the women that started it did not get to vote. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth and Frances Ellen Watkins Harper never got to vote. But they believed if they kept doing the work and other people would take up the mantle and pass the baton, it would get done. So that's the second thing I would say. Don't get discouraged. And the way you keep from being discouraged is knowing that it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And you're not doing it because you want immediate results. You're doing it to change things for the better, and that takes time. And the other thing I would say is, as a little girl, and we're about the same generation, there weren't any women on the Supreme Court. There weren't any women running for vice president. There were maybe a handful of women judges, and people still said lady doctors when they referred to women who were in medicine. So many doors have been opened. The trails have been blazed and the doors have been opened. There's still things that women are not doing in the numbers that they could do, but that wheel's been invented. That wheel of you can't stop me just because I'm a woman. Now, if you watch the way women are treated when in politics, you see the difference. You see the questions are different and the attitude is different. So the battle's still there, but the women are in the room now. We weren't even in the room then. When Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had that first convention, women weren't allowed to speak in public. You would be arrested. So you have to look back on what we have accomplished to keep from being discouraged and say, we can do this. We can totally do this. It's going to be hard, but we can do it.
Well, thank you both. I think this has been the most fantastic program. And,
Thank you.
and I'm so glad you could both join us. And everybody out there, I want to say I hope that you'll join us for our final suffrage program on Tuesday. Author Mara Rockcliffe will be reading her book, Around America to Win the Vote, about the cross-country journey in 1916 of Nell Richardson and Alice Burke to convince people that women should get the vote. And they took their cat along, which I think is awesome. So,
I love it.
I do too. So I hope we'll see everybody Tuesday at 11 a.m. For this last final program. And thank you two again. It's been wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you, Joy. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Bye. Thank you, Joy. Thank you, Sherrie and Mary and Sherrie.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.